European finals. I guess we start there. They're in all the front pages, Sarah. Do we start with the game or do we start with the chaos outside the game over in Paris?
I think the chaos outside the game, let's be honest, it took so long for the game to begin, you couldn't avoid the chaos. And I suppose watching from my seat on the sofa, I felt very nervous for those Liverpool fans because the pictures don't lie. They were squashed behind fences. They were showing their tickets. They were trying to get in. The sense of panic by everyone, even the commentators. It was just the fear of what could go wrong. And I was very uncomfortable sitting there waiting for the match. I'm glad that I didn't have any Liverpool fans or friends there that I knew of, because I would have been worried, to the point of massive anxiety, I think.
Yeah. Number of pieces. Kieran, anyone grab your eye?
Yeah, I thought Rob Draper, I think he captured it because I suppose one thing that really struck me was the amount of reporters that were able to turn around and go into such detail on the chaos that happened. Rob Draper has both tweeted, but also he is an extensive piece in the Mail, which would be pages 70 and 71 in the Irish edition. And basically it just seemed to be both excessive force, obviously, by the French police, but also just completely inept event management. And he talks about how there was this bottleneck created by vans being in the wrong, parked in an inappropriate place, and he could already anticipate that this was going to create a chain of events that would lead to chaos, and that's exactly what transpired. And he goes through it in a lot of detail as to just how shambolic it was and the obstinance of the police. So, I mean, it's just frightening how I'd imagine this isn't, as Sarah said, this is bigger than the event. And thankfully, I suppose we can say that nobody was killed, because unfortunately we've had echoes of this with Liverpool in major games, including European finals. I suppose we didn't see the footage because it was outside the stadium, whereas in Heysel we saw inside the stadium. We saw Hillsborough aspects of it, obviously, and just like this is the Liverpool fan base again, and the way that the French police and some of the statements from UEFA, were spinning out that this was because of fans, that the fans were to blame on this. It has been pointed out, all right, that, some fans may have been trying to get access without proper ticketing. But, that's where we go to major events everywhere, and, that's why there's certain checkpoints at certain spots to minimise the chances of that being an impediment. So it's a logistical nightmare. Just the fortunate thing is that that nobody was hurt, but by the same extent, like the trauma that, children being pepper gassed, and like Sarah was pointing out earlier just before we went on air, like a great former player who scored when Liverpool and Madrid last played in European Cup final in Madrid, Alan Kennedy could not get into the ground. Family, relatives of the players cut their losses and went away when, you know how hard it was to clamour for that final. It's one of the most coveted tickets in world sport. And UEFA, as much as the French police, there's questions obviously UEFA have to ask of the police, but I mean, I would say that the most, serious questions have to be asked of UEFA.
Well, absolutely. So in Rob Draper's piece, which you mentioned in the Mail on Sunday, for instance, he was talking about his experience. He said, as you got within 100 yards of the Stade de France, the bottlenecks began. Incredibly, the police had parked 3 vans to block a walkway. The reason was unclear. It was obvious what would ensue. The build-up of fans was growing. I mean, even that's just a terrifying situation. At 7:05 p.m, I first spoke to police in French and told them it was dangerous to move the fans. Most just shrugged. Some tried to help. There were children and blind fans trying to negotiate their way through a 3-metre gap. As I grew more frustrated, it seemed clear to me what was going to happen. One policeman agreed to call his boss. Yet again, why wasn't there anyone in authority here able to move the vans and prevent the danger? A few journalists have talked about those vans being parked in a very strange space and given just 3 metres for fans to enter at one particular part of the stadium. And on the next page, Joe Bernstein, again you mentioned this, Kieran, or alluded to it. Among those affected was Liverpool's 1981 European Cup match winner Alan Kennedy. He had to be helped over a fence near the stadium to avoid trouble. Marvin Matty, brother of Liverpool defender Joel, had to flee with his pregnant wife and took refuge in a nearby restaurant after police used tear gas, he says. Spain's Sports Minister Jose Manuel Franco reported he'd been among those caught up in the delays. I was an hour 100 metres from the stadium, he said. And Bernstein goes on to report some of the supporters who had paid 125 pence for a ticket eventually gave up trying to get in to see their team play in the Champions League final. Some of the videos do show the police being very heavy-handed in situations where it didn't require that at all.
Gary Lineker as well was tweeting saying, you know, we're not late, we just can't get in, we've been here for over 2 hours.
Yeah.
You know, this is the wrong narrative that UEFA are putting out. He was amongst the crowd, he wanted people to know that this wasn't their fault, and I think unfortunately to be caught up in that, it was also important for them to be able to give truth to the story, because obviously UEFA were trying to change the narrative.
Yeah, and they were booed, I think, when they initially put a statement up about fans being late to the game as being the issue. So, front page of the Sunday Times, Paul Rowan here and Hamza Khalik Lunat reporting here. Liverpool fans were pepper sprayed by French police amid chaotic scenes in the build-up to the Champions League final. From the start of which was delayed by more than 30 minutes, thousands of supporters unable to enter the stadium. Liverpool fans blamed stewarding arrangements, long delays in getting into the ground and heavy-handed police tactics for the trouble. UEFA initially said the game had been delayed because of the late arrival of fans. There were also reports of large numbers of ticketless supporters trying to enter the stadium and crushes developing, though there were no reports of any serious injuries. Video footage on social media showed police pepper spraying supporters who were stuck outside a locked gate at one end of the ground, which fans said was supposed to be open to let them in. The trouble cast a pall over the final, which Liverpool lost 1-0. Chris Sutton was among those outside the stadium and commented, coming in, there was a lot of shoving and pushing. There were fans trying to get through because there were ticket checks, and there were some fans who didn't have tickets, and they were the ones causing the problems. It was quite harrowing for a lot of people, and it was taking far too long to get through. The big issue in this is that there were a lot of fans trying to get in who didn't have tickets, and there's an element of responsibility from these fans not to try and get in and do the right thing. Of course there is, but I suppose ticketless fans turning up at events is not a new phenomenon, and as Kieran mentioned, generally you have to allow for human nature in these instances, and you have checks further away from the stadium. We've all had to show tickets, you know, a mile, 2 miles from a stadium to get into the initial perimeter, and why that wasn't the case in Paris is hard to fathom, really.
Around Croke Park you can't get past the top of the road, you know what I mean, and it's frustrating if some lad's waiting in the Croke Park hotel with the ticket for you, but if it avoids this kind of situation, then it's imperative that these barriers are in place. The
turnstile is not the point for checking the tickets. Yeah, we've all had to ring someone and say, can you come down? I'm at the bottom of the road, I can't get any further.
Can you leave your pint? Yeah, absolutely.
Jim Beglin, by the way, tweeted, this isn't in the newspapers, although the extent to which Twitter is such a source here is very evident in that lots of the papers have screen grabs of tweets by very reliable sources. So Jim Beglin, he tweeted just 3 hours ago, he said post-match, because post-match was a real problem as well, it seems, last night. Post-match last night was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. So Jim Beglin says, organised gangs set about mugging departing fans. We ran a gauntlet of thuggery on our way to the metro. Not a police officer in sight. Witnessed so many ambush attacks on unsuspecting attendees. Reprehensible UEFA. That's another chilling thought. So it seems post-match, the security and the arrangements were beyond ridiculous. And whilst we saw scenes of riot police liberally using a baton on people who didn't seem to be causing trouble in the videos I saw, you have no police officer inside on the walk to the metro, and the gangs thinking, well, free lunch.
That's absolutely frightening.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine wanting to attend an event like that knowing that my security or my safety was going to be, an issue.
Stade de France, Kieran, has hosted a lot of big events down the years.
True. I mean, you were looking at the atmosphere there yesterday, and you were thinking of, like it's routine for Ireland to go over there every 2 years, or like it's I suppose, like, I mean, one thing again that has to happen, like, is there has to be an investigation as to why this happened, and UEFA have to hold the French police to accountability. Obviously, they weren't the first choice, but as you said, it's a city and a venue that is used to major events and sporting events. So it's I mean, even just that point about what happened afterwards, you know, it is frightening. And I suppose, yeah, like again, I suppose it does show, like Sarah was making the point about Croke Park. I mean, you know, the whole we maybe take for granted, and I suppose we're coming out of COVID. You know, it's great to be back in mass stadiums and going to mass events again. You know, there is a lot that goes into them, but you know, like you take the French police seem to have been incompetent, right? But then for them to use essentially violence on innocent parties, that, right, it would have been one thing if there was a mess up in general, but then to resort to tear gas, right? It's just you know, like Paris got the event. You know, obviously it was meant to have been obviously because of the war, it had to be moved. But you know, it obviously was a shambles, and that should be remembered. That, you know, like every city gets like Paris would feature for major events like between Europa League finals or that. But I mean, there has to be again, UEFA have to hold the French police to account here as to what happened, but UEFA itself has to be held to account, because that was a shambolic event last night.
Yeah, and you do see the pictures. You see such an age, or a range in age rather. Like, I'm looking here on the front page of the Sunday Times. There's definitely a kid who's about 12 covering his face, and a woman who maybe looks early 20s, and then the kid's father, and then probably grandfather, and they're just standing behind the bars and holding up tickets as if to say, what's going on? You know, like, you could imagine the outrage. So I don't know how they made such a mess of that. That's extraordinary. And like, ticketless fans aside, there's no sense of misbehaviour or rushing to get in or anything which, you know, UEFA could almost cling to as what would be just a blatant excuse. There's no evidence of any of that.
Well, the Liverpool end was practically empty.
Yeah.
You know, 15 minutes before 8 o'clock. And I'm sitting there going, okay, there's clearly a disparity here between the stadium and what's happening outside, because you couldn't deny that it was empty. So where were all the fans who had travelled? So, you know, there definitely was a problem. So to suggest that it was fans arriving late who have categorically denied this and said they were 2 hours 20 minutes waiting to get in.
Yeah, this wasn't a last pint around the corner.
No.
And we'll get the last 5 minutes of the minor match. I mean,
too many seats empty for the Liverpool fans to be blamed for this.
It'd be interesting to see if there are any repercussions. I don't know what they might be.